Today we're here with Dr. David Weinberger, and we're going to be talking about how internet technologies and other things affect the way we think about knowledge and education. So let me intro Dr. Weinberger first, and then we'll start talking about how his ideas apply to the field of education. Dr. David Weinberger is a senior researcher at the Berkman Klein Center. He's been, among other things, a philosophy professor, a journalist, an internet entrepreneur, and a fellow and an advisor to several presidential candidates. He was for 4 years the co-director of the Harvard Library Innovation Lab, focusing on the future of libraries. Dr. Weinberger writes about the effects of technology on ideas. He's author of several books, including Small Pieces Loosely Joined, Everything is Miscellaneous, and his most recent book, which is, I think, where our focus mostly is today, which is called Too Big to Know, Rethinking Knowledge Now That the Facts Aren't the Facts, Experts Are Everywhere, and the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. So this will be an interesting interview, Dr. Weinberger, because usually when I have people on, it's folks who write directly about education. But I read your work, Too Big to Know, a few years ago, and then I've read subsequent works. Your work isn't actually on education, but I think the ideas really affect education, because you focus on knowledge and how it relates and how the internet technologies of today and the things that are going to go on affect the way we think about knowledge. So I guess the first question I have for you is, can you kind of summarize some of your, I guess, ideas about how the tools we use affect knowledge and how the way knowledge is changing, I guess, so that we can kind of springboard from there?
Okay, so the background for that is a contemporary idea which I first came across in a book by Andrew Clark, excuse me. I have Berkman Klein on mind. Andy Clark, called Being There, which lays out the case, I think, in a really convincing way. It's one of these books that when I read it, I said, oh, well, that's obvious, of course, but I hadn't thought about it before. So that's, I think, the best sort of insight. So what he says, I think, is really obvious in that sense, in the best sense, which is that we don't think in our heads, at least not in our heads alone, we think out in the world with tools. So that if you are a physicist and you're working on a problem, you cannot think if you don't have a whiteboard and a marker. Oh, that's my phone.
Oh, okay. Do you need to take that real quick?
Yep, and we'll start over. Sorry.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so I didn't take it, but I'm likely to get that call again. It's my wife.
Okay, sure. So should I guess I'll start.
It again, and I'll start it again.
I did some stuttering as well on my end, so let me just start. I guess my part again, I'll intro. I mean, the biography is fine. I'll start from the question. Okay, so Dr. Weinberger, this is an interesting interview because usually when I do interviews, it's with people who've written directly about educational issues. And your book, Too Big to Know, and your other works deal with knowledge, which I guess really does affect education, but you don't really deal directly with education. So for people who aren't familiar with your work, why don't we start with kind of a summary of your work, and particularly the work Too Big to Know, because the subtitle is really provocative: Rethinking Knowledge Now That the Facts Aren't the Facts, Experts Are Everywhere, and the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. So what do you mean by all this?
Well, the idea behind the book is that knowledge is shaped by its medium, and this is hardly a new idea, that thought is shaped by our media. Certainly Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s is responsible for furthering that idea. And there's been a recent line of thought that I think helps to flesh this out, which I first encountered in a book by Andy Clark called Being There. And it's one of these books that when you read it, you think, oh, well, that's obvious. But then you think, okay, it's obvious, but I'd never thought of it before. I'd never realized it before, which is the best way of being obvious, I think. So in that book, Clark argues that we don't the idea that we think in our heads is wrong. Obviously, brains are involved, but so are entire bodies, and most importantly, the world. So his argument is that we think out in the world with things. So if you're a physicist and you're working on a problem, if somebody takes away your whiteboard and your markers, you cannot think. You just can't do your work, your thoughtful work. And likewise, if you are you're a statistician, you cannot do your work without a computer. You could do it very, very badly with pencil and paper, but that's also thinking out in the world. We use tools to think without in the world. And that's, I think, as soon as Clark said this, as soon as I read it, I said, oh, yeah, of course, obviously we do. So that helps explain, I think, why something as mundane as the nature of paper can be responsible for, at least in part, for shaping something as ethereal and important as knowledge. So the book starts from that idea and then wonders what happens, if that's true, then what happens to knowledge when you remove it from paper, when it becomes digital, and most importantly, when it becomes connected. And it turns out lots of things that we in the Western tradition, because the book is only about the West, lots of things in our tradition that we've assumed are just obvious about the nature of knowledge, in fact, are only obvious if you're starting from paper, if paper is the medium for communicating and preserving knowledge. Take away the paper and knowledge changes in really important ways. And a few of those ways are that we have assumed that knowledge is settled. We don't talk about knowing something if we're not sure, or if our culture is still arguing about it, we just don't know. So knowledge is that which is settled, and we've assumed, in the same way that ink settles into paper, right? I don't think it's an accident. Once you've written something down on paper, once you've published it, you cannot take it back. And so knowledge has taken on that unchangeable quality. We've assumed that it is divided up into topics. And the topics are, everybody knows, are not perfect, but they're pretty good. And that maps a little too closely to the limitation of books, that they are only, they're only this big. They're not this big. They're relatively small, and they have a beginning and end. They have covers. That's more or less how topics work. And if we didn't have to publish ideas, knowledge in that form, then maybe the concept of topics and disciplines would change as well, including academic disciplines. A lot of our education is based around the idea of the world falling into relatively divisible topics, at least divisible enough that you can get a major in them, you can become a professional, and you can be tested in them. Knowledge, when it's on paper, has to be filtered.
That's fine. I'll edit this out. Obviously, I'll edit that part out.
Okay, I'm gonna get it.
Sure.
Okay,
no problem.
Pause. Hi, Ann. Can I call you back in 45 minutes? I'm in a live video. Anything urgent? Okay, I plan on leaving around 2:15. Thanks. No, okay, I gotta go. Okay. Okay, I'm very sorry. That was my wife, so she will, that interruption won't happen again, but there will be others. I'm here with my brother and sister-in-law, and who knows.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I'll just backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
And when knowledge is,
so you were talking about at that
I'm
point.
not sure.
We were talking about books and how
filtering
knowledge is kind of divided into these discrete subjects, because books and libraries are divided into discrete.
Right, I know. Right. Can I just continue as if I hadn't been interrupted?
Absolutely, and then I can figure out a good place to kind of splice it together.
Okay. And we've also assumed that knowledge is the result of filtering. That's from the very beginning of the idea of knowledge in the West, which was in the ancient Athens, where knowledge was first explicitly distinguished from opinion, because everybody had an opinion, but you had to try to figure out what was the right way of steering the city-state. Well, if knowledge is on paper, then it continues this tradition of being filtered, because paper is expensive. Very few books are published compared to the volume of manuscripts that come in. And so knowledge we have assumed is something that is a result of filtration. But you take away paper and those limitations, which also have strengths, but those limitations go away. And so knowledge is right now beginning to change its shape. It is much less settled and incapable. I think we're losing the illusion that we can settle knowledge. I want to be careful. There is such a thing as knowledge and truth, and science gets closer to it in general than anything else we know. But the idea that we can have a sincere, open, honest conversation with anybody, and if everybody is reasonable, bring them to a single truth, we now, I think, see that that's just not the case, which is, in some ways a disaster, but that's the way that it is. It is unfiltered. That is, the filtering happens after publication. So anybody can put whatever they want up on the web, of course. But then we have evolved this very complex and usually pretty efficient system of filters by which we decide what's interesting to us and what we think is worthwhile. So that's filtering, but it's after the fact, not before the fact. And it is, sure, topics continue to exist, but the web is characterized most deeply by being linked, and links transgress boundaries. That's their point, including the boundaries of topics. So you can reimpose topics onto a field, and that's often quite useful, but you're aware that you're imposing something foreign to it, and you're drawing borders that don't actually exist. Sometimes it's useful to do that, but topics are seen less as a structure of knowledge or of the world than they used to, and more like a pragmatic imposition.
Sure. I think about
for our own sake.
There was one instance I remember when I was teaching where I was really made aware of this. You talked about how knowledge seems less and less settled. So this was when I was a college professor in an education college, which I am now. And I was in a classroom. I was talking about a particular thing that some researchers have found about kind of a useful education method. I don't remember the details exactly. One of my students said something about, well, I heard in another class kind of a different bit of information. So which one is correct? So we kind of started to think about, okay, which one of these is correct? And the assumption is that one of them has to be correct. So I went home and the students went home and we all kind of researched it online and other places. And what we found out was that some people just disagree about which one of these is correct. It's either X or it's Y. And everyone kind of wanted to figure out which of these is correct. And the only conclusion we could come to is it looks like online, we don't know which one is correct. And I have to imagine maybe 60 years ago when the internet really didn't exist and make these kind of disagreements really visible, where the only place you could go to research was, to your library and the journals, it probably wouldn't have looked like people disagreed. But now, of course, it's made glaringly evident.
Yeah, I think that part of the situation is exactly that we can now see the level of disagreement that was pushed beneath the line of visibility drawn by the media. So in the old days, if you read one of the handful of newspapers in your city, and they expressed a really very narrow range of ideas. I mean, the political spectrum of them tended to be quite narrow. It was Democrats and Republicans and fairly moderate versions of each. Other voices were not just marginalized, they were inaudible. You simply couldn't find them often. Now it's gone the other way. So you can hear every crazy voice in the world, and many of them are not crazy. Some of them actually are crazy. And so it's a totally different landscape. It's a different power structure, and it requires a different set of techniques to be taught to, for example, students. It is utterly different. But part of our being upset at the presence, the lack of being able to settle questions, is due, I think, to our just coming out of a prior media regime in which it sounded like we all agreed because we couldn't hear the voices that disagreed. Now we can, and we see that, in fact, we never, ever agreed about anything. Every time I say this, though, I want to be really careful because there are some things that are true and some things that are false. And there are some things that we can know to be true in some sense of the word true. And so I do not want to sound like I'm proposing, well, whatever you believe that's good enough, or that's true for you, but it's not true for me. I mean, that's often just a nonsensical phrase.
So let me bring this into kind of the realm of education, because one of the things your work makes me think about, if we're talking about knowledge being unsettled, and the internet kind of really gives us a clear picture of how unsettled it often is. One of the things you talk about is kind of the old model of expertise, where there were certain people who kind of were the repository of all the kind of best that's been thought and stuff like that, and knowledge filters kind of through those people. And I think about teachers and professors, because that's kind of the role that teachers and professors, it seems to me, have kind of played with students. Is students come into school or college, and the professor's there, and the professor is the repository of knowledge, and the professor's job is to filter that knowledge to students so that students can learn kind of what the professor knows. And it kind of strikes me that, you know, to your phrase, the smartest person in the room is often in the room at this point. It kind of strikes me that with the way your work conceives of the changing nature of knowledge, it seems that the way we teach and learn may have to change, because teachers are no longer necessarily the smartest people in the room. It may be that students have to, in some ways, they have access to all the knowledge the teachers have, whereas that before that wasn't necessarily the case.
Yes, I think it's desperately important that the way we teach change. And that's happening to some degree just naturally in response to how students come into classrooms these days, because they've been trained not by the newspapers and not by the encyclopedias. They've been trained by going out on to the net. So their information gathering is very different than it would have been coming into a classroom 20 years ago. I'm very hopeful about this, because part of the reason why the book is called Too Big to Know is that the fundamental premise is that our strategy has been, until now, has been to try to know a universe that is vastly larger than our capacity to know it by engaging in strategies that reduce what there is to know. And one of those strategies is to enable experts as people who know a great deal about a relatively small bit. Sometimes it's comically small, but usually it's not. You know, I like experts, but that's been a fundamental strategy. Break the world into brain-sized bits and let people focus on them. Now we have, if we use tools to think in the world, the tool that we have now is not just computers. It's a network that connects us and data all in one gigantic mass. And that's an opportunity to vastly increase what it is that we're able to know, where the we is not your head or my head, but is networks of people who are engaged with one another. And that's the room, the smart room that the subtitle's talking about. That's a semi-clever way of talking about the networking of knowledge. It's not really a room, it's a network in which you have multiple people who are engaging with one another, who know more than any individual, because they are more than one individual, but they're connected. And they're connected in difference, or sometimes in actual disagreement. Because a network that consists only of people saying the same thing is not any smarter than any individual. In fact, it's probably going to make itself stupider. So a knowledge network, at a minimal, consists of people who are engaged with one another, iterating on differences. And it's what that network as a whole knows that is, I think, now the measure of knowledge. So we want to build, in my view, smart networks of people who are engaged generally constructively, so that the network itself knows more than the individual. And I just want to be careful. When I say knows, I don't mean that it's become conscious in an AI sort of way, but rather it's the connection, the social engagement of the people that is where the knowledge exists.
Sure.
And that does mean teaching very differently, because you're trying to turn out good knowledge citizens, so to speak, people who know how to engage constructively in a network, including and especially with people with whom they disagree.
Sure. It's, I mean, I guess the other thing that strikes me about it is when I think about, because you do mention network knowledge a lot, that's kind of a core feature of your book. So you talk about things like the ability of crowdsourcing to help really solve problems, because every one of us may know a little bit of something, and we kind of get together and solve these problems in a large scale. So if we're talking about students, it seems to me we want to prepare students to function in that type of world. But when you compare that to classrooms, we often focus on individual work done individually. You take tests individually, you solve problems individually, and the idea is you do things very individually. And then we give you kind of an individual grade. I mean, do you have any thoughts about kind of that method of education where it's really focused on your individual ability to solve problems versus preparing students to go out into these worlds where really a lot of what they'll be doing is this networked knowledge, using networks to solve problems?
Yeah, so on the one hand, of course, you want competent individuals. But it seems to me that the emphasis is wildly wrong at this point. Sort of the implicit message is that we need to make you into a strong, brave knowledge pioneer who's going to head out into the wilderness of knowledge on her own and then come back with, the big game or whatever. And nobody works that way. I don't think anybody ever did, but now it's really clear that this is not how we're going to proceed. Let me also put in parentheses that there are, within every discipline, there's certainly a core of knowledge that you must know internally if you're going to be able to make sense of that discipline or that bit of the world. If you're a chemist, you really need to know the periodic table. If you are, and it's different in different disciplines. If you are history, then you need to know another set of things. If you're an English major, then there's a different set, and the rules of evidence are different and all that. So, but we're good at teaching our students that. But you're not going to, none of us at this point go out into the world of the internet as individuals and count on blazing our own path. And it's not even, part of it is that we've gotten this idea from the very origins of the web in the early 90s that the internet is an information resource, that it's a gigantic library, but unlike a real library, there's no curation, so there's stuff in it that's terrible and shouldn't be believed right next to the stuff that is worth believing. And so, sure, it's wonderful, there's so much stuff we keep telling ourselves, so many publications of various sorts, but oh for the old days when responsible adults would dictate what made it into the library, and now we have this uncontrolled library. Well, yes, and yeah, sure. I mean, that's one way of viewing it, but it doesn't explain the cultural importance of the internet, because this thing has swept through our civilization in a way that no technology has. I mean, literally since fire, as quickly or with as many deep transformations. I mean, it just hasn't happened. So there's something else that's going on here. It's not that suddenly everybody decided that they really want to become amateur research librarians. They want to go on the net in order to research information. Oh, we go on the net to answer questions, to talk with other people, to explore, to browse, to waste time, to all the different things that we do. It is not, you cannot understand it primarily as a publishing source or a library or a source of ideas and content. It is much more a connection between us. So you go out, if it's anything beyond, when was Hamilton born, some simple fact which you get by typing into Google and it just tells you. If it's anything, I picked a very bad example because I think it's not clear when Hamilton was born. I don't know why I picked that. The worst possible example I could give of a simple fact. If it's anything that's more interesting than that, which is what we want our students to be interested in the world. So they go out and they will, even if it's a review of of a cell phone or a video game, or it's a more interesting question. They go out and they're not just reading something, they're tweeting about it or Facebooking it or Instagramming it, and they're getting comments back and they're finding what other people said and following a link or two, we hope, and discovering that there's always more, there's always another link, and that people don't always agree about these things. This is what the internet is best at and what I think it's most important for in education. So the idea that, and every time you do this, you're engaged in a social world, explicitly in a social world. You're dealing with a network that was created, a set of links and relationships created by other people, almost always by strangers. This is wonderful. It's humanizing because it reminds us that, in fact, knowledge is a human construction, and the humans who construct it are not always superhuman experts who must be believed because they've gone through the filtering system and it's your job simply to consume and then repeat back on the test. It's ennobling. It stimulates curiosity, and it enables us to take advantage of the relationships among people who are interested in the same thing but who disagree about it in one way or another. And we want students to get really, really good at that. We don't want to put the burden of knowing the entire universe on each individual student's shoulders. And so sending students out to do reports and bring them in as if they are now the expert, they're a little junior expert, and they're going testing them as individuals, as if they are going to succeed in their knowledge quest as individuals, treating the internet as a set of resources that can be declared worthy or unworthy, whereas almost everything is in between, treating the internet as if it were a set of nodes, a set of content pieces like books in a library, instead of as a universal conversation in which, and of a link structure that connects those. All of these seem to me to be entirely out of touch with how not just students are learning, the young people are learning, but the way that we use the internet, every one of us. That's what we do.
It's funny because when I teach, both when I taught high school and when I teach college level courses, occasionally I'll be assigned to teach something that I don't really feel terribly fluent in. And one of the things I'll end up doing is spending a lot of time online, whether it's starting with Wikipedia and going from links out there and then following those links out and following those links out. And it always occurs to me, one of the best things I could do as a teacher is instead of doing that myself, I could set up a situation where students actually do that, because it always occurs to me there's no reason students can't be doing what I'm doing right now. They could be doing those following links and contributing to different sources of knowledge and like you said, looking at this conversation. But it always feels like we, as teachers, the inertia is to follow that existing model of I have to be the one to do the research, give it to students, and then they consume it, rather than have them actually produce knowledge by giving them those tools, and then they do the searching and they kind of come back with reports on kind of what the vast survey of knowledge out there is.
Yep. There's a researcher named Alison Head. I think her group is Project Information Literacy, PIL, who a couple of years ago did some research on college students, all of whom are, and it's quite typically, prohibited from using Wikipedia. Go out, professors understand they're going to go out onto the internet, but do not use Wikipedia. And of course, she found that they all do. But they don't cite it, which is, they're not allowed to do. But they use it to do what you just described, which I think she's the one who invented this, I'm not sure, which is pre-search, not research, but pre-search. You need to do a report on the periodic table. And so the first thing that you do is go to Wikipedia. So if you don't know anything about it, you go there and you see what the general, what you need to know. What are the big topics? Who has been talking about the periodic table? And then you go out to those links, but you don't mention that you use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an incredible pre-search tool, and if it's not that, it's something else. And not only is there no shame in using Wikipedia, it's a completely appropriate use of it. Why would you not tell your students not to use this resource that's, I think, is going to be as famous in history as the Gutenberg press was, just as is such a wonderful example, and actually so important. Why would you not let your students use it for the thing that it's best at least for that, for what you use it for? Exactly. When somebody uses a term you don't understand, you go to Wikipedia.
I suspect that the reason is because we're still holding to the idea of expertise that you kind of say is kind of the older way that's still relevant in some cases, but not all cases, right? Wikipedia is not written by the same people that wrote the previous encyclopedias, which were the experts in the field. Wikipedia is written by a whole bunch of people. The bad thing about that is it can change every 5 seconds. It can also be the good thing about that, but we still have this idea, I guess, that we want to teach students to look at the experts in the field rather than looking at knowledge that's created by this kind of messy, potentially crowdsourced way to do it.
Well, so I think it's, at least sometimes the thinking is that it certainly used to be that Wikipedia is unreliable. I think that we hear that less these days, although sometimes it is unreliable. I think the thinking is more like, well, your college students now, you can't just go to an encyclopedia. So they're treating it like an encyclopedia. But it's different. In the old days, when you went to the library and you used an encyclopedia, it was a little bit like cheating, because instead of having to do the original research, or not original research, but you are getting a pre-digested expert view of it, and it's too easy or something. But students are not using, I mean, sometimes they use Wikipedia that way, but that's not, when they're using it for pre-search, they're doing something different, which is they're getting a quick view, a quick layout of what the field is, and then using that to drill down or to explore out. That can happen much more easily in the world of the web, because everything is linked, than it could in the library, where you took down the single volume of the encyclopedia, read it, and if you wanted to find the rest of the books to read, you had to figure it out. You had to go to the shelves. You had to, the barrier was much higher. So sure, now kids are lazier. Yeah, no, the material is one click away. It allows them to explore far more fluidly, and that changes the nature of exploration. It's now way cheaper in terms of time and labor to look at a source and to reject it. That's good. We want that's part of the critical thinking skills. We want students to be able to read something and decide relatively quickly, because life is finite, that no, this is written at a second grade level, it's not going to help, or wow, it sure seems like it's biased, so it's not. You want to let people reject really quickly. That's an important skill for researchers. Now, because everything is a click away, that skill becomes even more important and more beneficial. So the fact that the internet is a linked place, obviously, changes the nature of the starting point. Encyclopedias used to be a shortcut to the end. Now encyclopedias are a shortcut to the beginning, to further exploration.
Right. So another question I have for you is that, especially in the educational world, a lot of teachers, scholars, writers are kind of concerned about the negative effects of technology, whether it's in the classroom or at home. So you hear a lot of people talk about how technology affects negatively, let's say, short-term and long-term memory, because now we can offload so much to the internet that we kind of come to rely on it. Or there's so many links that we have information overload that it affects how long we can pay attention to stuff. So smartphones and computers are apparently kind of shortening our short-term memories and making us quote unquote dumber. I know you've done some work on that, responding to some of those folks, because you're a little bit more optimistic in terms of what the internet and things like that are kind of doing. They're not necessarily making us stupider, but they're making us more interconnected and actually making the collective intelligence, I guess, smarter, if you will. So what are your thoughts on that, especially for folks who are thinking about, should we be allowing students to really rely increasingly on internet technologies rather than going, and reading kind of long books and things like that? What are your thoughts on those issues?
This goes back directly to thinking as a process, something we do out in the world with tools. So first of all, the question of whether it's shortening our memory and making it harder for us to fix short-term memories into long ones and follow long chains of reasoning, that's a matter for science. And it's, it's the sciences, as far as I can tell, as a non-scientist, is tending to support that view. It's not unanimous. But Plato/Socrates said exactly the same thing. And he was right. He objected to the new literacy that was coming on two grounds. The first is that you cannot respond. Somebody says something in a book or on a tablet or whatever. You cannot respond. You can't question. That's very true. And the second thing is he said it would shorten our memories. And that's exactly what happened. Before literacy, the Greeks were memorizing the Iliad. It's a pretty long poem, but people were able to do it. And now we laugh at that. There's no conceivable way. And maybe you have some savant who can do it. But no, we can't memorize long swaths of poetry, thousands of lines. We can't memorize hundreds of lines. So we lost something. And Socrates was completely right about that. But what he didn't account for is the fact that by writing things down through literacy, overall, the system, that is all of us involved in the system, got smarter. We were able to externalize memory onto paper or clay tablets or whatever, scrolls, whatever we prefer. We're able to externalize memory on tablets because then we are smarter, even though we remember less. We're smarter because we have something like, we have this stuff accessible to us. The same thing is happening now. So let's grant that our short-term memory is getting worse. Not sure, but it certainly is for me, but I'm getting old. Let's just grant that. To say that therefore we need to shut down the internet or withdraw from it in order to preserve it, I think it would be to make a tragic mistake, because it's looking at intelligence only at the level of the individual, not at the intelligence, the knowledge, even the wisdom that a culture can have by externalizing a whole bunch of stuff, but having it available not just in discrete chunks the way that we used to in the world of physical libraries, but connected. Connected through people, connected through ideas. It would be, I think, a huge step backwards in our intelligence in order to preserve my intelligence or your intelligence.
Yeah, it almost seems like, I guess the analogy I usually use in the classroom, because I talk to students about, the works of people like Andy Clark and people like that, it seems like students are more intelligent when they have to memorize a head full of facts, when they have to do things like you said, like memorize the Iliad. It would seem like students are much more intelligent when they have to do that, and now they don't. But if you think about it a little bit differently, what it does is when you have the Iliad on paper and you have all these facts on the internet, that students no longer have to necessarily memorize all of them. They just have to remember how to get to them. What that does is it frees up their brain to do a whole lot of other stuff that it couldn't have done before. Because when you have to memorize the Iliad, there's a whole lot of stuff your brain could have been doing that it wasn't doing. So now we've freed up that space in the brain, and not that space in the brain, but that time and energy to do other things.
So yes, that's the positive idea, and I certainly am. I certainly promote that idea, because I think it's the idea that needs to be. We hear the negative all the time, and so I think it's worthwhile to point to what I think is at least as deep a positive. It is certainly the case. So I was born in 1950, and during my childhood, education moved away from rote learning, which means I did not memorize a lot of, or basically any, poetry. And I think my life is diminished because of that. Times I've tried, and it's very difficult for me to do. I assume my education has something to do with that. We moved away from rote teaching in order to achieve some other educational aims, which I happen to think are more important than my ability to have internalized big chunks of poetry. So I don't regret that. I don't regret that sort of decision that was made for me, but I did lose something by not being able to remember big chunks of stuff. And in the same way, we will lose something. And some of it is a shame to lose, and some of it I think is okay. In fact, is good to lose. And one of the things I think it's good to lose, I'm going to regret saying this, is the focus on long chains of thinking as the ultimate form of knowledge or human intelligence, the high point. It's good to be able to follow long chains of thinking, and particular disciplines, it's crucial. Nevertheless, the idea that the world should be understood that the world is constructed in long chains of logic, and that the human project should be to figure out what those long chains are, seems to me to be not even true. I think we are seeing more and more now that our technology enables us to see it, that the world is in fact pretty chaotic. It's not derivable from a simple set of laws with the clock ticking perfectly and the mechanism working predictably. It's really not like that. And the construction of long chains of reasoning and even long narrative chains are to some degree artificial. They hide the complexity of the world. And I think our science has been coming to this conclusion for the past 100 years. And I think our culture is as well. So it bothers the fact that we may be losing our ability to construct long chains of reasoning doesn't bother me as much as probably it should. I suspect that we valorize that way of thinking because that's how books work. Books favor pages that go in order and you'll follow one after another. That's not how the world works, though.
Yeah,
I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, you describe it as, I guess, kind of if you look at the way a book works and you think of that as how knowledge works, it looks very unidirectional. It goes from the second page, the second chapter follows from the first chapter, third from the second. But if you look at the way the internet works and you think of that as how knowledge works, it looks really scattered because everything's hyperlinked to everything else. And in some ways, what that makes me think of is the student who has trouble paying attention to like a longer lecture or whatever. We usually treat that student as kind of there's something wrong with them because they're not learning the way they're supposed to be learning. But maybe in some ways, the way we think you're supposed to be learning is actually a byproduct of the book that follows from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and it is unidirectional versus the way the web is. So maybe that student is actually just learning in a different way that's more like the web than a book.
Hold on one second, because now my brother has entered.
Oh, sure.
I'm in a live TV, semi-live TV thing, video thing. Okay, okay.
Yeah, we're on the tail end.
Yes, I can.
Longer.
Who's watching?
Mm-hmm.
Anybody I care about watching? No. Okay.
Excellent question. I recorded though, Andy. Thank you. Okay. It'll be over soon. Thank you. That was my sister-in-law you saw crossing behind me before.
Yeah. I have some slides that I can intersperse in so that if someone's walking across the room, I can actually edit a slide over what we're saying to kind of make it, take that out. So.
Yeah, that's up to you. This is obviously very informal. So let me address your point. There's certainly a school of thought that thinks that attention deficit disorder is not a disorder, it's only a disorder in a particular culture, et cetera. That there's virtue in thinking that through. But I'm old-fashioned enough to think that, well, yeah, I mean, there are obviously different learning styles, and there's also different abilities. Forget the internet, there's always been different abilities to attend to something for a long period. Some people are really, really good at it, and they can burrow down into a question for the rest of their lives and become narrow but deep, deep, deep experts in something. But in its most positive way, I guess we could say that it's possible that we're seeing a shift from an emphasis on deep learning to an emphasis on wide learning, where I think both are valuable. And I don't think we'll ever lose both. I think the sort of deep, narrowish expert that's a personality trait, and we're not going to lose that. And we would be far worse off if we did lose it. Nevertheless, we now can see a type of wide learning in which many connections among many different pieces, somebody can draw those together, and that's a type of knowledge and even wisdom as well. We're much less experienced in dealing with it because it's much harder, for example, to test for that. It doesn't have, by nature, it does not have edges. So how do you test for it? It's not a content-based skill. That's more of a procedural skill. But I think we are figuring out to see the value in that.
Great. Well, this has been a really, really interesting talk, and I think we did a really good job of taking your ideas and kind of thinking about the educational ramifications of them. So I hope the viewers get a lot out of this too. Dr. Weinberger, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.